When Marcus inherited his grandmother's house in rural Pennsylvania, he thought it would be a blessing, a chance to escape the suffocating rent of Philadelphia and start fresh in a place with history and character. But from the moment he stepped through the warped wooden doorframe, something felt fundamentally wrong about the property. The house was a 3-story Victorian built in 1887, its exterior painted a faded yellow that had turned the color of old teeth, with black shutters that hung at odd angles like broken wings. And as Marcus walked through the musty hallways during that first inspection, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was breathing around him, expanding and contracting with each step he took across the creaking floorboards. His grandmother, Margaret Walsh, had lived alone in this house for 43 years after her husband died in a farming accident, and according to the lawyer who handled the estate, she had spent the last decade of her life becoming increasingly reclusive, refusing visits from family, and communicating only through brief cryptic letters that spoke of keeping watch and maintaining the seal. Marcus had barely known her. His own mother had been estranged from Margaret since before Marcus was born, some family dispute that no one would explain to him even now. But the inheritance was substantial enough that he couldn't refuse it. The house and 5 acres of overgrown property, plus a modest trust fund that would support him while he figured out his next move. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Diane who kept glancing at her watch throughout the walkthrough, it explained that the house had been empty for 6 months since Margaret's death, and that several potential buyers had expressed interest but ultimately backed out for reasons they wouldn't specify. She said this with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Marcus noticed how she refused to go down to the basement, claiming that the stairs were unsafe, even though they looked sturdy enough to him. That basement became an obsession for Marcus almost immediately, not because there was anything obviously sinister about it, but because of the door at the bottom of the stairs, a door that seemed older than the house itself, made of some dark wood that looked almost black in the dim light, with iron hinges that were forged in a style Marcus had never seen before, decorative but also somehow purposeful, like they were designed to hold something in rather than simply support the weight of the door. The door had no handle, only a large iron lock that required a key Marcus didn't possess, and when he asked Diane about it, she claimed ignorance, said she'd never been given a key to that particular lock, and suggested he call a locksmith if he really needed to get in there. But something in her voice, a slight tremor, a quickening of pace, told Marcus that she knew more than she was saying. He moved into the house on a grey October afternoon, his few possessions fitting easily into 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. And that first night, he lay awake listening to the sounds of the old house settling around him, the groans of wood and the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, and beneath it all, so faint he thought he might be imagining it, the sound of something moving behind that locked basement door, a soft shuffling that could have been rats or could have been something much larger dragging itself across a concrete floor. Marcus told himself he was being ridiculous, that he was spooked by the unfamiliar surroundings and the gothic atmosphere of the house. But when he finally drifted off to sleep sometime after 3 in the morning, he dreamed of his grandmother standing at the top of the basement stairs, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes reflecting no light, and she was saying something to him, mouthing words he couldn't hear, and when he woke with a start, he could have sworn he heard the echo of her voice finishing a sentence. Never open it after dark. The next morning, Marcus decided to explore the basement properly, armed with a powerful flashlight and a crowbar in case he decided to force the lock, and as he descended the wooden stairs, he noticed things he had missed during the initial walkthrough with Diane, specifically a series of symbols carved into the walls on either side of the staircase, symbols that looked vaguely religious but didn't match any iconography Marcus recognized from his limited knowledge of Christianity or other mainstream faiths. They were angular and aggressive, like warnings etched by someone with an unsteady hand and a desperate urgency. The basement itself was larger than he expected, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the house, with a low ceiling supported by thick wooden beams that were wrapped at intervals with what looked like old electrical wire, though the wire didn't seem to connect to anything. It just spiraled around the beams in tight coils before ending abruptly, and Marcus wondered if this was some kind of primitive grounding system, or perhaps something his grandmother had installed during one of her increasingly paranoid final years. The locked door stood at the far end of the basement, and as Marcus approached it with his flashlight, he saw that more symbols had been carved directly into the wood. These ones fresher than those on the staircase walls, deep gouges that looked like they had been made recently, possibly in the months before Margaret's death. And there was something else too, a smell emanating from the gap beneath the door. Not the musty odor of mold, or the organic decay of a dirt floor, but something chemical and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. It mixed with something organic and sweet that made Marcus's stomach turn. He pressed his ear against the door and listened, holding his breath. And for a long moment there was nothing but his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. But then he heard it again, that shuffling sound, closer now, directly on the other side of the door, and with it came a new sound, a wet, labored breathing that sounded almost human but not quite, as if someone with damaged lungs was trying desperately to draw air through a throat that wasn't designed for breathing. Marcus jerked back from the door, his heart racing, and as he did, he heard something else, a voice, faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance or through water, and it was saying his name, Marcus, Marcus, in a tone that was both pleading and commanding. And he recognized the voice, even though it had been years since he'd heard it. It was his mother's voice. But his mother was alive and well, and living in Arizona. He had talked to her on the phone just 2 days ago. He stumbled back toward the stairs, telling himself that the house was playing tricks on him, that the sounds were just pipes settling, or animals that had gotten into the walls. But even as he tried to rationalize what he'd heard, he knew it was something else, something that his grandmother had kept locked away for decades, something that knew his name and wanted him to open that door. That evening, Marcus began searching the house in earnest, looking for any documentation his grandmother might have left behind that would explain the locked door and the symbols throughout the basement. And he found what he was looking for in her bedroom, a large master suite on the 3rd floor that looked out over the overgrown property. Inside the closet, hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, he discovered a leather trunk containing dozens of journals, their covers cracked and faded, dating back to 1962, the year his grandmother had moved into the house with her husband. Marcus carried the trunk downstairs to the kitchen, where the light was better, and began reading, starting with the earliest journal. And what he found there was a chronicle of a slow descent into something that wasn't quite madness, but wasn't quite sane either. In those early entries, Margaret wrote cheerfully about fixing up the house, about her plans for a garden, about her husband Thomas's work as a veterinarian in the nearby town. But then, about 3 months after they moved in, the tone began to shift. She started mentioning sounds in the basement, scratching behind the locked door that Thomas dismissed as rats, and she wrote about dreams that felt too vivid to be dreams, visions of people standing around her bed while she slept, their faces hidden in shadow, their hands reaching toward her, but never quite touching. Thomas had wanted to break open the locked door, according to Margaret's account, but the previous owner of the house, an elderly man named Ezekiel Marsh, had made them promise as part of the sale agreement that they would never open that door, never attempt to break the lock, and that they would maintain certain rituals to keep whatever was behind the door contained. At the time, they had laughed it off as the superstitious ramblings of a senile old man, but they had signed the agreement anyway because the house price was so low they couldn't refuse it, and Ezekiel had seemed so desperate to make sure they understood the importance of keeping the door locked that they had humored him. The rituals, as Margaret described them, were simple but specific. Every night before bed, they had to draw water from the well in the backyard and pour it in a circle around the exterior of the house. They had to burn sage in the basement on the first night of each new moon, and they had to never, under any circumstances, speak the name Malachi within the walls of the house, especially not in the basement. And certainly not near the locked door. For the first year, Margaret and Thomas had followed these rituals faithfully, treating them as a quirky tradition, a way to honor the house's history. But as time went on and nothing happened, they had grown lax, skipping nights here and there, forgetting to check the lunar calendar. And then Thomas had died, crushed beneath a tractor that rolled on unstable ground, and Margaret was alone in the house with whatever lived behind the locked door. After Thomas's death, the journals became increasingly frantic. Margaret wrote about seeing shadows move independently of any light source, about hearing her husband's voice calling to her from the basement, even though he was dead and buried. And she wrote about the dreams that recurred almost nightly, where she would find herself standing in front of the locked door, and the door would be open, and something would be emerging from the darkness beyond. Something that had her husband's face, but wrong somehow, stretched and distorted, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's eyes. And it would reach for her with hands that had too many fingers, and she would wake up screaming, her nightgown soaked with sweat, and she would run down to the basement in the grey light of dawn to check that the door was still locked, and it always was, the iron lock secure, the symbols she had carved into the wood still fresh. The most disturbing entries came from the final years of Margaret's life, when she had stopped maintaining most of the house and focused all her energy on keeping the seal, as she put it. She wrote about reinforcing the door with additional locks she had installed herself, about the symbols she carved not just in the basement, but throughout the house, on every threshold, on every windowsill. She wrote about communication with whatever was behind the door, how it had learned to speak to her in Thomas's voice, how it bargained with her, promised her things, reunion with her husband, knowledge of what came after death, power over life itself. And she wrote about how tempting these offers were. How some nights she stood in front of the door with a key she had stolen from Ezekiel Marsh's estate after he died. How she held that key in her shaking hand and listened to her dead husband's voice, begging her to let him out, promising that everything would be all right if she just turned the key. But she never did. According to her journals, she resisted, and in one of the final entries, dated just 3 weeks before her death, she wrote something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It has learned to be patient. It has learned to wait for the next owner. Someone younger, someone more curious, someone who doesn't remember the old warnings. I have failed. I should have burned the house down years ago. Instead, I am leaving it to my grandson. And may God forgive me. Marcus sat in the kitchen as the sun set outside, the journals spread before him, and he understood with horrible clarity that his grandmother had not left him this house as a blessing, but as a burden, or perhaps as a test. She knew he would be curious about the locked door. She knew he would search for answers, and she had left these journals knowing he would find them, knowing they would tell him just enough to be dangerous. As darkness fell completely, Marcus heard the sound again, that shuffling behind the basement door, and this time it was accompanied by something new, a rhythmic tapping, metal on metal, someone, or something, working on the lock from the inside, and Marcus realized with growing horror that whatever was behind that door had been patient for a very long time, but its patience was wearing thin. Marcus didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the kitchen, reading through the rest of Margaret's journals, searching for any information about the key she had mentioned, the one she had stolen from Ezekiel Marsh, and in a journal from 1979, he found a detailed description of where she had hidden it, wrapped in oilcloth and buried in the backyard beneath a specific marker, an old iron stake that had been driven into the ground near the property line. The journal entry explained that she had buried the key as a precaution, to put it somewhere she couldn't easily access in a moment of weakness, somewhere that would require deliberate effort to retrieve. And she had marked the spot, but only in her journals, never verbally, never in a way that someone stumbling upon the property might discover accidentally. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink, Marcus made a decision that he knew was foolish, but felt inevitable. He would find the key, he would open the door, and he would confront whatever his grandmother had been keeping locked away for all these decades, because living in this house with that mystery unsolved, with those sounds coming from behind that door every night, was a special kind of torture that he couldn't endure. He spent the morning searching the overgrown backyard, fighting through waist-high weeds and tangled brush, looking for the iron stake Margaret had described, and he found it near the eastern property line, exactly where she had said it would be, rusted almost black with age, barely visible above the ground. And when he brushed away the dirt and weeds around its base, he could see that it had been driven deep. At least 3 feet down, as if whoever had placed it had wanted to make sure it would remain there for a very long time. Marcus used a shovel from the garden shed and began digging. The earth was hard and resistant, full of rocks and roots, and it took him nearly 2 hours to excavate a hole deep enough to reach what Margaret had buried. But finally, his shovel struck something that wasn't earth or stone, something wrapped in what had once been canvas but was now mostly rotted away. And inside that, he found the oilcloth, still intact. And inside that, the key. It was larger than he expected, at least 6 inches long, made of iron that had been worked by hand, with an ornate bow that featured the same symbols he had seen carved throughout the house, and the teeth of the key were complex, far more intricate than any lock he had seen on that basement door should require, suggesting that the door's mechanism was more sophisticated than it appeared, or perhaps that the key served some purpose beyond simple mechanical function. Holding the key in his hand, Marcus felt a strange sensation, a vibration that seemed to come from within the metal itself, not quite a sound, but a feeling, like holding a tuning fork that was resonating at a frequency just below the threshold of human hearing. And with that vibration came images, flashes of memory that couldn't be his own. He saw the house as it had looked a century ago. He saw people in old-fashioned clothing performing some kind of ceremony in the basement. He saw the door being built, saw symbols being carved into the wood by hands that shook with either fear or reverence. And he saw something else, a glimpse of what lay beyond the door, a space that couldn't exist within the normal geometry of the basement, a room that extended in directions that hurt to think about. And in that room, something moved, something that had been waiting for such a very long time. Marcus shook his head, clearing the visions, and walked back to the house with the key clutched in his hand. And as he approached the back door, he saw something that stopped him cold. There were muddy footprints on the back porch, leading from the basement bulkhead doors to the kitchen entrance. And they weren't his footprints, they were smaller, and they had a strange quality to them. The mud was dark, almost black, and it seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence in the morning light. And the prints themselves were wrong somehow. The proportions weren't quite right, too wide at the heel, too narrow at the toe, as if whatever had made them had feet that were shaped like human feet, but weren't actually human. He followed the footprints through the kitchen and up the stairs to the second floor, where they led directly to his bedroom. And there they stopped, right beside his bed, exactly where he had been lying just hours before. And Marcus realized with a cold certainty that while he had been sitting in the kitchen reading journals, something had come up from the basement, had walked through his house, and had stood beside his sleeping form, watching him, and then had returned to the basement before he noticed. And the only reason he knew this had happened was because it had left these footprints, either carelessly or deliberately, as a message. A reminder that locked doors were only truly secure if whatever was on the other side chose to respect them. That night, Marcus descended to the basement with the key in his pocket and a plan forming in his mind. A plan that was probably foolish, but felt like the only option available to him. He would open the door, he would confront whatever was behind it, and he would either end this mystery once and for all, or he would join his grandmother in whatever fate she had been trying to prevent. The basement was colder than he remembered, or perhaps it was just the fear making him sensitive to the temperature, and as he approached the locked door, he saw that the symbols carved into the wood were glowing very faintly. A soft phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Or perhaps it was the other way around. And perhaps his heartbeat was synchronizing with the pulse of the symbols, an unsettling thought that made him pause at the threshold. Behind the door, he could hear breathing, slow and deep, and underneath that, a sound like water dripping in a vast cavern, echoing off unseen walls. And as he stood there listening, the breathing changed, became faster, excited, as if whatever was on the other side could sense his presence, could sense the key in his pocket, and was anticipating the moment when the lock would finally turn and the seal would be broken. Marcus pulled the key from his pocket and held it up to the lock, and in the dim light of his flashlight, he could see that the keyhole was not empty. There was something inside it, something that looked like organic matter, dark and fibrous, blocking the opening. And as he watched, this matter began to withdraw, pulling back into the door as if making way for the key. And he understood that the door itself was alive in some way, or was connected to something alive, something that wanted very much to be opened. He inserted the key into the lock, and the moment metal touched metal, he felt a shock run through his arm. Not electrical, but something else. A transfer of information or intent. And suddenly he knew things he hadn't known before. He knew that the door had been built in 1762 by a man named Malachi Whitmore. He knew that Malachi had been a scholar of forbidden knowledge who had discovered a way to thin the barrier between this world and another place. A place where things that should not exist waited with infinite patience for opportunities to cross over. And he knew that Malachi had built this door as a portal, a controlled passage that would allow him to communicate with these entities and bargain for power and knowledge. But something had gone wrong. The entities had proven more intelligent and more patient than Malachi anticipated. They had learned to manipulate him, to make promises they never intended to keep, and in the end they had consumed him. And all that remained was this door, this locked gateway, passed down through generations of owners who were charged with keeping it sealed, each one eventually succumbing to curiosity or madness, or the whispered promises that came from the other side. Marcus knew all of this in an instant, downloaded directly into his consciousness through the key, and he knew one more thing, the most important thing. That if he turned this key and opened this door, he would be breaking a seal that had held for over 2 centuries, and whatever came through would not stop with him, would not be satisfied with one house in rural Pennsylvania. It would spread, slowly at first, but with increasing speed, finding others like Marcus, people who were curious, people who were dissatisfied with their lives, people who could be tempted with promises of knowledge and power, and it would build more doors, more passages, until the barrier between this world and that other place collapsed entirely. And yet, despite knowing all of this, Marcus found his hand turning the key, because the alternative was spending the rest of his life in this house, listening to that breathing behind the door, feeling those footprints appear beside his bed each night, and slowly losing his mind the way his grandmother had, and at least by opening the door, he would have answers. He would know what he was dealing with. And perhaps, just perhaps, there would be a way to close it again, to reseal what he was about to unseal. Though even as he thought this, he knew it was a desperate rationalization, a lie he told himself to justify a decision he had already made. The lock clicked, smooth and certain, as if it had been waiting for this moment, and was relieved to finally perform its function, and the door swung open on hinges that should have been rusted solid, but moved with perfect silence, and beyond the door was darkness. Not the simple absence of light, but a darkness that seemed to have substance and depth, a darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence. And from within that darkness came his grandmother's voice, not distorted this time, but clear and present, saying, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I tried to warn you." And then the darkness poured out of the doorway like water from a broken dam, spreading across the basement floor, climbing the walls, extinguishing his flashlight, and plunging everything into a blackness so complete that Marcus couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. And in that blackness, he felt hands, dozens of hands, maybe hundreds, touching him, pulling him, not violently, but insistently, drawing him forward into the doorway, into the space beyond. And he tried to resist, but his body wouldn't obey him. His muscles had gone slack. His will had evaporated, and the last thing he felt before the darkness took him completely was a sense of profound regret. Not for himself, but for everyone else. Everyone who would eventually find their way to a door like this one, because now that he had opened it, the doors would multiply, would appear in basements and attics and forgotten rooms all over the world, and they would whisper their promises to anyone who listened. And they would wait with infinite patience for someone curious enough, or desperate enough, or foolish enough to turn the key. Marcus opened his eyes and found himself standing in a place that shouldn't exist. The geometry was wrong in ways that his brain struggled to process. Walls met at angles that added up to more than the mathematically possible total. And the ceiling seemed to recede into an infinite distance, while simultaneously pressing down on him with claustrophobic intensity. The space was lit by a sourceless gray illumination that created no shadows, but somehow made everything seem darker than it should be. And the air had a quality that felt thick and resistant, as if he was breathing something that was only nominally air, something that contained other elements his lungs weren't designed to process. The room was vast, stretching in all directions farther than he could see, and yet it also felt cramped and confined. As if the space itself was pressing in on him from all sides, and scattered throughout this impossible room were objects, artifacts, that looked like they had been pulled from different time periods and different cultures. He saw what looked like ancient Greek amphorae sitting next to modern office furniture, saw stone tablets covered in cuneiform next to stacks of contemporary newspapers, saw religious icons from a dozen different faiths arranged in patterns that suggested purpose rather than random accumulation. And among these objects were people, or at least things that had once been people. They stood perfectly still, frozen in various poses, their faces blank and expressionless, their eyes open but seeing nothing. And Marcus recognized some of them from photographs he had seen in his grandmother's journals. And previous owners of the house, going back generations, all of them standing here in this impossible space, preserved like specimens in some vast collection, and he understood with horrible clarity that this was his fate too, to stand here forever, another artifact in this endless museum of the lost and the curious. But then he noticed something that the others didn't have. He could still move. His body still responded to his commands. His mind was still his own, and when he looked down at his hand, he saw that he was still clutching the key. The iron was warm now, almost hot, and it was glowing with that same phosphorescent light he had seen on the symbols, and he understood that the key was protecting him somehow, creating a bubble of reality around him that allowed him to maintain his autonomy in this place where autonomy should not exist. A voice spoke behind him, his grandmother's voice, and when he turned, he saw her standing there, but she looked different from the photographs he had seen. Younger, healthier, as she might have looked in her 30s before grief and fear had aged her prematurely, and she was smiling at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding that made his heart ache. "You opened it," she said, not an accusation but a simple statement of fact. "I tried to warn you, but I knew you would. Curiosity is a Walsh family trait, runs through our blood like a genetic disease." Marcus tried to speak, but found his throat was dry. His voice came out as a whisper. "Where are we?" Margaret gestured around them. "This is the place between places, the space that exists in the gaps of reality. Malachi Whitmore discovered it in 1762, thought he could use it to gain power and knowledge, thought he could bargain with the things that live here. But he didn't understand that this place doesn't follow our rules, doesn't respect our concepts of time or space or identity. It's a collection, a museum, and everyone who opens a door into this place becomes part of the collection." "How are you here?" Marcus asked. "How are you moving when everyone else is frozen?" Margaret's smile turned sad. "I'm not really here, Marcus. I'm just an echo, a recording left behind when I died. The real me is standing over there." She pointed across the vast room to where Marcus could barely make out a figure that looked like an elderly woman in a nightgown, standing perfectly still among the other frozen forms. "But before I became that, before this place took me completely, I left this echo, programmed it with everything I knew, hoping that if you opened the door, if you ended up here, this echo could help you." "Help me do what?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Escape," Margaret said simply. and seal the door behind you permanently. Not just locked, but destroyed, erased from reality so thoroughly that it can never be opened again. Not by you, not by anyone. Marcus looked at the key in his hand. This key is protecting me. If I use it to go back, will the protection last? Margaret shook her head. The key's power is temporary. You opened the door with it, which created a debt. The longer you stay here, the more of that debt accumulates. Eventually, the key won't be able to protect you anymore, and you'll freeze like the others. How long you have depends on your will, your strength of mind. For some people, it's minutes. For others, it's hours. But it's never permanent. Then how do I escape? Marcus demanded, feeling panic rising in his chest. Margaret pointed across the room to something Marcus hadn't noticed before. Another door, identical to the one in his basement, standing free and unsupported in the middle of the vast space. That door leads back, but it's not as simple as walking through it. You need to understand what this place is, what it wants. The entities that maintain this collection aren't malicious in any human sense. They don't hate us or want to hurt us. They're just collectors, curators of a museum that spans dimensions. And they collect things that are curious. Things that seek knowledge they shouldn't have. Things that open doors they should keep closed. So everyone here opened a door? Marcus asked, looking at the frozen figures. Not everyone, Margaret said. Some were brought here by others, loved ones who couldn't bear to be separated. People who followed the curious through the doors before they understood what they were doing. But yes, most of them chose this. In one way or another, they chose curiosity over safety, knowledge over ignorance. Marcus felt anger rising. So we're being punished for wanting to know things? That's insane. Margaret's expression remained neutral. Not punished, collected. There's a difference. And you're not wrong to be angry. But anger won't help you escape. What you need is understanding. This place exists because there are things in the universe that humans aren't meant to comprehend, realities that our minds aren't equipped to process. Malachi found a way to peek behind the curtain, to see these realities, and the curators of this place were fascinated by that, by the fact that something as limited as a human mind could even conceive of looking. So they created this collection, this repository of curious minds, and they've been adding to it ever since. How do I destroy the door? Marcus asked, forcing himself to focus on practical matters rather than philosophical ones. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Marcus saw that it was a piece of obsidian, polished to a mirror shine. This is a piece of the original door that Malachi built. And I stole it years ago. Didn't even know why I did it at the time, just felt compelled. But now I understand it's a key of a different kind. If you take it back through that door, she pointed to the freestanding door across the room, and if you place it in the exact center of the basement floor above where the door stands, and if you speak the name that must not be spoken, the name of the one who built the first door, the entire structure will collapse. Not just the physical door, but the connection between this place and your world. All the doors will seal simultaneously. Everyone trapped here will be freed. Though what form that freedom takes, I can't say. Marcus took the obsidian shard. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, as if it was absorbing heat from his hand. Why didn't you do this? Why did you leave it for me? Margaret's echo flickered slightly, like a bad television signal. I couldn't. By the time I understood what needed to be done, I was too far gone. The collection had too much of me. I couldn't leave this place anymore. I could barely leave this echo. And besides, it had to be someone with the key. Someone who opened the door willingly. Someone who could still move in this space. That's the requirement. The curators don't make the rules. They're just following a pattern that's been established since the first door was built. And speaking his name will destroy everything? Marcus asked. Malachi Whitmore? Margaret's echo shook her head violently. No, not here, never here. If you speak it here, You'll become part of the collection immediately. The key won't protect you. Nothing will. You have to speak it in the basement, in the real world, with the obsidian at the center point. That's the only way. The echo was fading now, becoming translucent. I'm running out of time, Marcus. I programmed myself with limited energy. But there's one more thing you need to know. When you seal the door, you'll feel tempted to stay here, to join the collection willingly, because in the moment of sealing, you'll see what the curators see. You'll understand the full scope of reality in a way that's intoxicating, terrifying, and beautiful. And part of you will want to remain, to keep seeing, but you have to resist. You have to turn away and run. Run back to the mundane world and never look back. Because if you hesitate, if you give in to that temptation, even for a moment, the door will seal with you on the wrong side. Marcus wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand everything, but the echo was dissolving, Margaret's form breaking apart into particles of light that dispersed into the grey illumination, and her final words came to him as barely a whisper. I'm proud of you, Marcus, prouder than I ever was able to tell you. Now go, run, and don't open any more doors. He was alone in the vast, impossible room, surrounded by frozen figures and scattered artifacts, and the only sound was his own breathing and the faint hum of the key in his hand. And Marcus realized that he had a choice to make. He could try to escape, could try to seal the door and free all these people from their eternal collection, or he could simply stop fighting, could let the key's protection fade, and join his grandmother in whatever form of existence these frozen figures were experiencing. And for a moment, just a moment, that second option seemed appealing, seemed easier than facing what he would have to do. But then he thought about everyone else in the world, all the people who might someday find a door like his, might hear the whispers and make the same mistakes he had made, and he knew he couldn't let that happen, couldn't let this collection continue to grow. Marcus started walking toward the freestanding door across the room, and as he moved through the space, he noticed details he had missed before. The frozen figures weren't completely still. They were breathing, their chests rising and falling almost imperceptibly, and their eyes, which he had thought were vacant, were actually moving. So tracking his progress across the room with an awareness that suggested they weren't quite as gone as he had believed. And he wondered if they were conscious in there, aware of their situation, but unable to move or speak, trapped in their own minds with nothing but their thoughts for company. And the idea was so horrifying that he had to stop thinking about it, or he would collapse right there. The walk to the door seemed to take forever. The room kept shifting around him, distances becoming meaningless. Sometimes he felt like he was making progress, and other times he felt like he was walking in place. But eventually, after what might have been minutes or hours, he reached it. The door stood before him, identical to the one in his basement. The same dark wood, the same iron hinges, the same symbols carved into its surface. But when he reached for the handle, he found there wasn't one, just like the original. It was a door that opened from the other side, a door that required a key. Marcus held up the key that had brought him here, the key that was still glowing with that phosphorescent light, and he touched it to the wood of the door, and immediately the door began to change. The symbols on its surface started to move, rearranging themselves into new patterns, and a keyhole appeared where none had been before, and without hesitation, Marcus inserted the key and turned it, and the door swung open, and beyond it, he could see his basement, the familiar concrete floor, the familiar wooden beams, and it looked like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Ordinary reality, mundane and safe and comprehensible, but as he stepped toward it, preparing to cross the threshold, he felt something grab his ankle, not a physical grip, but something else, a presence, an attention, and he looked down and saw that the floor beneath his feet had become transparent, and beneath it was something vast and incomprehensible, something that looked at him with curiosity and interest, the curator itself, and it was asking him without words, without any communication he could properly describe. It was asking him if he really wanted to leave. If he really wanted to give up this opportunity to see and understand things that no human should see or understand, and for a terrible moment, Marcus wanted to say no, wanted to stay and keep looking. But then he remembered his grandmother's final words, remembered the obsidian in his pocket and the task he had to complete. And with an effort that felt like tearing away part of his own soul, he pulled his attention away from the curator, stepped through the door, and slammed it shut behind him. He was back in his basement, the familiar smell of damp concrete and old wood, and the door behind him was sealed shut. The keyhole had vanished, and Marcus pulled the key out of his pocket and threw it as far from himself as he could, watching it skitter across the floor and disappear into the shadows. And then he collapsed against the wall, his whole body shaking with reaction. And he realized he was crying, tears streaming down his face, not from fear or relief, but from a sense of loss so profound it felt like grief, because he had seen something in that place, something beautiful and terrible, and now that he was back in the ordinary world, he would never see it again. And part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, mourned that loss. Marcus didn't know how long he sat there on the basement floor. Time seemed to have lost its meaning after his experience in that other place, but eventually he remembered what he still had to do. The obsidian shard was still in his pocket, and he had to place it at the center of the basement floor, had to speak the forbidden name and seal the door permanently. He stood up on shaky legs and pulled out the shard. It was still cold, colder even than before, and in the dim light of the basement, he could see his own reflection in its polished surface. But the reflection was wrong. His eyes in the reflection were slightly too far apart. His mouth was curved in a smile he wasn't making, and when he blinked, his reflection didn't blink with him. It just kept staring at him with those wrong-spaced eyes and that unsettling smile. Marcus forced himself to look away from the reflection and began calculating where the center of the basement floor would be. He paced out the distances, trying to be precise, because his grandmother's echo had been specific about this. It had to be the exact center. And when he thought he had found it, he knelt down and placed the obsidian shard on the concrete, and immediately things began to happen. The temperature in the basement dropped so quickly that his breath became visible, white clouds forming with each exhalation, and the symbols carved into the walls started glowing, not with the soft phosphorescence he had seen before, but with a harsh white light that hurt to look at directly. And from behind the sealed door came sounds, not the shuffling and breathing he had grown accustomed to, but something new. Voices, dozens of them. Hundreds maybe, all speaking at once in languages he didn't recognize, and underneath those voices was a deeper sound, a vibration that he felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears, the sound of something immense stirring, becoming aware, focusing its attention. Marcus realized that the curators knew what he was about to do. They were trying to stop him, or maybe not stop him exactly, but they were definitely reacting, and he understood that he had to act quickly, before whatever was happening escalated to a point where he couldn't complete the ritual. He stood above the obsidian shard, took a deep breath, and spoke the name that must not be spoken. Malachi Whitmore. And the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The sealed door exploded outward. Not with physical force, but with a burst of that same dark substance he had seen pouring out when he first opened it. Only this time, it wasn't spreading slowly. It was erupting like a geyser, shooting toward the ceiling and spreading across the walls. And where it touched the symbols went dark, their light extinguished. And the voices behind the door became screams, and Marcus understood that he had triggered something irreversible. The door was collapsing. The connection between this world and that other place was breaking. But the process wasn't clean or safe. It was violent and chaotic, and he was standing at the center of it. The obsidian shard at his feet began to crack, thin lines appearing on its polished surface, spreading like a spider web. And from those cracks came light, not white or phosphorescent, but a pure golden radiance that pushed back against the darkness pouring from the door. And where the light and darkness met, reality itself seemed to ripple and distort. And Marcus could see through those distortions into other places, other basements, in other houses. All of them with similar doors, all of those doors beginning to crack and splinter as the ceiling spread through the network of portals that Malachi had created over 2 centuries ago. And then he saw something that made him understand the true scope of what he was doing. In those other basements, there were people like him who had opened their doors, people who were standing in those impossible spaces or who had already frozen into the collection. And as the doors sealed, these people were being pulled back. I yanked out of the collection and returned to their basements, returned to reality, and the frozen figures that his grandmother had showed him, all those previous owners and their loved ones, they were being freed, released from whatever timeless existence they had been trapped in. But there was a cost. Marcus could see it in the way reality was straining around the obsidian shard. The fundamental structure of space was being forced to accommodate something it wasn't designed to accommodate, the complete severing of a connection that had been maintained for centuries, and that strain was creating cracks. Not physical cracks, but deeper ones. Fractures in the fabric of what was real and what was possible. And Marcus understood that by sealing the door, he might be saving countless people from being collected. But he was also creating instabilities that could have consequences he couldn't predict. The darkness from the door was receding now, being pulled back by the golden light from the obsidian, and the voices were fading, becoming distant. And Marcus felt a strange sense of vertigo as the basement around him seemed to shift and settle, as if the house was adjusting to the absence of the portal that had been part of its structure for so long. And then there was a final flash of light, so bright that Marcus had to close his eyes. And when he opened them again, the basement was silent and still. The obsidian shard had shattered completely, reduced to a fine black powder that was already dispersing into the air, and the door at the far end of the basement was gone, not just sealed, but erased. In its place was just a blank concrete wall, and even the symbols that had been carved into the wood were gone. And Marcus felt in his bones that the connection was truly broken, the portal was closed, and it would never open again. He climbed the stairs out of the basement on trembling legs, and as he reached the ground floor, he heard something that stopped him cold. Footsteps upstairs in his grandmother's bedroom, and for a moment he thought the ceiling hadn't worked, thought something had come through after all. But then he heard a voice, a woman's voice, calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" And Marcus recognized the voice, even though he had only heard it in recordings and echoes. It was his grandmother, but not the old woman from the photographs. It was the younger version, the one he had seen in that other place. And when he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, he found her standing in the hallway, looking confused and disoriented, wearing the same clothes he had seen on her frozen form in the collection. "Margaret," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper, and she turned to look at him, her eyes widening with recognition, even though they had never actually met in life. "You're Marcus," she said, not a question but a statement. "Thomas's grandson, you did it. You sealed the door." And then her legs gave out, and she collapsed. And Marcus rushed forward to catch her, and as he helped her to a chair, he saw that she was crying, tears streaming down her face, and she kept saying, "I thought I would be there forever. I thought I was lost." And Marcus held her while she cried, this woman who was his grandmother, but who looked younger than he was, who had been trapped for decades in a place where time had no meaning, and he didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain that in this world, in this timeline. She was already dead, had been dead for 6 months, but here she was, solid and real, and crying in his arms. Over the next few days, other people began to appear at the house, drawn by something they couldn't explain, previous owners of the property who had been freed from the collection. Some of them had been trapped for years, others for decades. And like Margaret, they had no memory of the time they had spent frozen. For them, it was as if they had stepped through the door one moment and been standing in Marcus's basement the next. And they were all confused and traumatized, and desperately grateful to be back in the real world. Marcus did his best to help them, to explain what had happened, to contact their families when those families still existed, and in some cases to help them understand that everyone they had known was gone, that decades had passed while they had been away. And it was heartbreaking work, sitting with these people as they grappled with the reality of their situation, but it was also necessary because he was the only one who understood what they had been through, the only one who had seen that place and returned by choice. His grandmother stayed with him in the house, and slowly, over weeks and then months, she began to adapt to this new reality. She was legally dead, had no identity in this world, but Marcus helped her create a new one. Found her a social security number from someone who had died as an infant, or helped her build a life that could exist in the official records. And in return, she told him everything she remembered about the door, about Malachi Whitmore, about the decades she had spent trying to keep the seal intact. And together, they began to understand the full scope of what had happened. The doors, it turned out, had not been limited to just houses in America. Malachi's research had spread farther than Marcus had realized, through books and letters and secret societies, and people all over the world had built their own versions of the portal, had created their own connections to that collecting place, and when Marcus had spoken the name and shattered the obsidian, all of those doors had sealed simultaneously. And people who had been trapped in the collection for centuries, people from different eras and different cultures, were suddenly being returned to a world they didn't recognize, and Marcus began receiving letters and emails from all over the globe, from people who had heard about what happened, about the man who had sealed the doors, and they wanted to thank him, wanted to share their stories, wanted to know how they could help others who were struggling to adjust. Marcus and his grandmother started a foundation, quietly at first, funded by the sale of some of the artifacts that people had brought back with them from the collection, objects from that impossible museum that turned out to be valuable in this world, ancient manuscripts and lost artworks and technological devices that shouldn't exist yet. And with that money, they built a network of support for the returned ones, as they came to be called. People who had been to that other place and come back changed, and the foundation provided therapy and resources, and most importantly, community. Because these people needed to be around others who understood what they had experienced, who wouldn't dismiss their stories as delusions or hallucinations. But there were consequences to the sealing that Marcus hadn't anticipated. The fractures he had seen forming in reality during the ritual had not healed completely. There were places in the world now where the laws of physics didn't quite work the way they should, where time moved at different rates, or where space folded in on itself in subtle but measurable ways, and scientists were beginning to notice these anomalies, were beginning to ask questions about what had caused them. And Marcus knew that eventually, someone would trace the disturbances back to that night in his basement, back to the moment when he had spoken a forbidden name and broken a connection that had existed for over 2 centuries. He also knew that the curators of that collection were still out there, still in that other place, and they were not happy about losing their museum, their repository of curious minds. And while they couldn't rebuild the doors, couldn't recreate the connection that Malachi had forged, they could influence reality in other ways, subtle ways, inspiring dreams and visions in people who had the right kind of mind, people who were curious about forbidden knowledge, people who might try to find a new way to thin the barrier between worlds. And Marcus understood that his work was not finished, that he would spend the rest of his life watching for signs of new portals, new attempts to reach that other place, and doing whatever was necessary to stop them before they could succeed. His grandmother understood this too, and together they became guardians of a sort, protectors of the barrier between worlds, and they trained others, recruited people from among the returned ones who were willing to take on this responsibility. And slowly they built an organization dedicated to making sure that what Malachi had started would never happen again, that the doors would remain sealed, and that humanity would remain safely ignorant of what existed in the spaces between realities. Marcus often thought about his grandmother's final words to him, her echo's warning to never open any more doors, and he had taken that advice to heart. But he had also learned something else from his experience, that curiosity was not a curse, but a gift. that the desire to know and understand was what made humans special, what made them more than just animals following instinct, and the trick was not to suppress that curiosity, but to direct it toward things that could be understood, toward mysteries that had solutions rather than toward doors that should remain closed. The house in Pennsylvania became the Foundation's headquarters, and Marcus had the basement completely renovated, poured new concrete over the spot where the door had been, built walls and rooms, and created a space that was dedicated to helping people heal from their experiences rather than being reminded of them. But sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, he would go down to that basement and stand on the spot where the door had been, and he would remember what he had seen in that other place, the vast, impossible room, the frozen figures, the curator's attention, and he would feel that same sense of loss he had felt when he first returned. The grief for something beautiful and terrible that he would never see again. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would feel the floor beneath his feet vibrate very slightly, as if something far below was moving, as if the curator was still there, still watching, still curious about the human who had escaped its collection and sealed its doors. And Marcus would stand very still and wait for the vibration to pass. And then he would go back upstairs and continue his work, because that was all he could do. Continue to guard the barrier. He continued to help the returned ones, continue to make sure that what happened to him would never happen to anyone else. And he accepted that this was his life now, his purpose, his penance for the curiosity that had led him to open a door he should have kept closed. And though the burden was heavy, he carried it willingly, because he knew what the alternative would be, knew what would happen if the doors ever opened again, and he would do whatever was necessary, pay whatever price was required to make sure that never happened, because some doors, once closed, must remain closed forever, and some curiosities, no matter how compelling, must never be satisfied. And that was a lesson that Marcus had learned the hardest possible way, but it was a lesson he would never forget. And it was a lesson he would spend the rest of his life teaching to others, hoping that they would learn from his mistakes, hoping that they would understand that not all knowledge is worth the cost of obtaining it, and that sometimes the wisest thing a person can do is to walk away from a locked door and never look back, no matter how desperately they want to know what's on the other side.